Hey guys, I'm glad you guys made it back. Hope you enjoyed part 1 enough, and that's why you're back for part 2. This is the second half of the Noisy Records Goth podcast. You may remember in the last episode, we talked about the birth of Goth all the way up until about 1981, 82, and the F Club up in Leeds and the formation of Sisters of Mercy and all the stuff that had been going on since Goth's beginning up until club life. Today, we're not going to waste any more time. We got a lot to cover, so let's get straight to it. And we're starting it all off with the role that glam played in the making of Goth.
There's a new sensation, a fabulous creation, a danceable solution to teenage revolution. Do the Strandler.
We said punk was important in all this, but we can't deny glam's role. That was huge in all of this as well. It was a mainstay of the club nights, and its influence was huge. The makeup, the androgyny, the silky clothes, and add a little bit of lace here and there and some leather. It's obvious they were influenced by glam. Show me one true goth who didn't like Bowie, Roxy Music, or T-Rex. Think about it. Bauhaus was covering T-Rex by their third single, and the B-side, by the way, was a John Cale tune. It wouldn't be long before Bauhaus did that fantastic split single with Bowie's version of Ziggy Stardust on one side and Eno's Third Uncle on the B-side. The Banshees actually wouldn't be the Banshees without the help of Roxy Music, because that's where Susie met Budgie at a Roxy Music gig back in '75. Robert Smith didn't hide the fact of how much he loved David Bowie. He said once that David Bowie's Low album changed the whole way he saw sound. So we see glam, just like punk, was vital in making this whole scene happen. There's definitely a noticeable shift that happens in '82. More and more albums are being released by these quote-unquote goth bands. The Church, Modern English, the Banshees released my favorite album of theirs in 1982, A Kiss in the Dream House. And that's also the same year that the Cocteau Twins made their debut. Undeniable that there's a real cohesion starting to come together with this goth sound. But it's when an unknown band moves up to London that goth creeps out of the shadows and into the spotlight. This scene finds its new lair, and suddenly the music and fashion come together and everything truly becomes goth. Bristol wasn't proving to be very kind to ghouls. It was only too obvious. And so Specimen decided that playing street parties in honor of the royal wedding of Charles and Di wasn't really going to get them anywhere. And yes, that is true. That was their first gig. So they decided to pack their bags and head up to London. They had no idea of what an impact that would make on music and the club world. It was here that Ollie Wisdom and John Klein decided to start their own club night, on the very uncool Wednesday night, I might add, at a place they called the Batcave.
Good lovers, oasis in grey. You know that you need some heart. What did it say? Lovers, lovers, lovers of that time. Lovers,
Now in London, goth is truly taking on its own form, even though no one had been officially called goth yet. Instead, a lot of the bands that were playing in the scene were simply referred to as Batcave bands. That, of course, is in reference to the Batcave. The club, of course, would become synonymous with all things goth and was even called the Goth Garden of Eden. Overall, though, it was a short-lived venture. It only lasted about 3 years, but that was just long enough for record labels and the press to catch on, thus legitimizing the whole scene. It could have simply just been a case of right place, right time, but in truth, the Batcave had a slight advantage in its pedigree, which I think gives it the edge and quite honestly made it more legit. Remember, the F Club up in Leeds, it moved around between a handful of venues. Could be a university here, polytechnic there, venue for hire, or a pub. It didn't matter. But the Batcave, it pretty much stayed in the same place at 69 Dean Street down in Soho. That's not pedigree, though. This is just simply location, location, location. When I say pedigree, I mean there's something truly different in its blood or its bloodline. I mean, let's be honest. Gargoyles and bats are a tough hand to beat. And believe me when I tell you, this is exactly what John and Ollie had on their side with the Batcave, because their Batcave was actually inside the former Gargoyle Club. How goth is that? During the 20s, the Gargoyle Club was quite a posh place and boasted members such as Henri Matisse, who actually had a couple of his works hanging there in the club for quite a long time. It's also interesting to think about, but it was Matisse's Blue Nude that was used on the cover of the Sisters of Mercy's Alice single. Speaking of the Batcave, David J. from Bauhaus put it this way. It had sort of this Dickensian Jack the Ripper flavor to it, in the back streets of Soho. It was very dingy and very much had the faded glamour of old Soho. It was romantic in that way. It was easy to project one's gothic fantasies onto the locale. It's also really interesting to think about Bauhaus's role in the Batcave, and that they may have actually been a key factor in helping the club to grow and gain its reputation as the goth place. I'll tell you why. Before it was the Batcave, it was a club called Billy's. Once again, very ungoth. And it was in the early 80s that Bauhaus got a 4-week residency there. And it was while Bauhaus was playing at Billy's that one night Ian Curtis showed up, and he met the band, and he proudly proclaimed that he was the owner of a couple of their early singles. So anyway, the local and regional goths had become familiar with Billy's because of Bauhaus. And so when the Batcave moved in, it already had somewhat of a reputation of a gothy type place. Of course, for Bauhaus, when the Batcave opened, it was a natural place to be and to make as their watering hole. So you see, I'm not that far off when I make the claim that I think the Batcave had a real pedigree that set it apart. And it's also here where this odd bedfellows of reggae and goth meet again. The Gargoyle Club was on top of the building, and down in the basement was yet another famous club called Gossips. And Gossips were known for their reggae night, as well as playing a cool mix of blues and jazz. But hey, we're talking about the Batcave, so let's get back upstairs. The club, it was on the top floor, and the only way to get up there was by this shoddy elevator that only held 2 people at a time. When you got to the top, the elevator door would open up to a coffin that had its bottom knocked out. And you would walk through this coffin into what was the place to be if you wanted your dungeon to be in a penthouse setting. No wonder, with all this attitude and music and this kooky decor, that it was a favorite drinking spot for Bauhaus, Robert Smith, Susie and the Banshees, Mark Allman, Zodiac Mind Warp, and, according to club lore, there were some serious bouts of drinking happening between this new kid in town named Nick Cave and the unofficial barman Nick Fiend. Now, Ollie and John started their night to be an alternative to the snooty new romantic scene happening across town over at the Blitz Club. They wanted a club where anyone could come and enjoy some good music, and they relished in the fact that it became a magnet for freaks and spooks and outcasts. It's true, the Batcave is known as the home of Goth, but it actually did set quite a precedent in what would be called the modern club culture. They were actually alternative before alternative was around. They had this strict no funk, no disco policy, and that turned the dance floor over to truly alternative music at the time, playing reggae, rockabilly, of course very heavy on goth and glam. The club goers quickly became diehard fans and hardcore followers, and even started making their own jewelry like a little coffin with wings as an easy indicator that these diehards were true goths and dedicated followers of the club, not just some wannabes. They also made their own membership cards as well, festooned with a little bat that said Batcave. Of course, with all this going on, the club's reputation spread really quick, and it wasn't long before the music weeklies and trendy magazines started to get wind of it. Sounds and The Face, both of them started running playlists of the music that was being played down at the Batcave. Now, the Batcave may have been the home for Goth, but the record label for Goth would have to be Beggar's Banquet. It was actually a record chain, and two of the guys that worked there started a record label just to print their favorite punk records on. But obviously, things turned into so much more than they had imagined. One of their main early acts they signed was Two-Way Army. That, of course, was Gary Newman. And it could easily be said that Newman is pretty much responsible for the label's early success. As he started to gain popularity and have hits, it bankrolled the label and allowed them to be able to expand, taking on more acts and putting out more records, eventually turning it into what would be the strong arm of Goth. Think about it. They carried such acts such as Bauhaus, Newman, Tones on Tail, The Cult, The Bolshoi, Gene Loves Jezebel, Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry, Flesh for Lulu, and more. And then they had two spin-off labels, Situation 2 and the artsy-fartsy, glamorous 4AD. You add all that together and you have royalty. Then you throw into the mix Fields of the Nephilim, The Birthday Party, Cocteau Twins, Modern English, Ex-Mal Deutschland, This Mortal Coil, Dead Can Dance, Clan of Zymox, The Pixies even. I think you can easily say this label on its own was the whole goth movement in one little nutshell.
Is the
Some of the goth bands started their own labels as well, and perhaps the most recognizable one is Merciful Release by the Sisters of Mercy. The band started their own label to release their own music, which they did for all of their albums, and they also signed a few other bands to it as well, including March Violets and James Ray in the Performance. The Sisters released their first single, Damage Done, in 1980 on their own label, and just for those who are into trivia, it's the only time Andrew Eldritch played drums. After that, it would forever be the infamous Dr. Avalanche drum machine. Susie and the Banshees created their own label as well. They were signed to Polydor, but they started a spin-off label called Wonderland. You know, Budgie and Susie were romantically involved, and they were trying to keep it hush-hush, and they started a side project called The Creatures. So when they created Wonderland as a label, it was the perfect launching pad for The Creatures releases, as well as another side project of Susie and the Banshees called The Glove with Steve Severin and Robert Smith. Wonderland would end up carrying all the Banshee releases for the rest of their career, as well as everything by The Creatures and The Glove. "1983 put the Batcave and its dedicated followers in the glossies. The press taking interest in the scene helped tremendously. The NME did a story on the still yet unnamed scene and tagged it briefly as positive punk and said, "There's no empty promises of a revolution, either in the rock and roll sense or the wider political sphere. Here, is only a chance of self-awareness, of personal revolution, of colorful perception, and galvanization of the imagination that startles the slumbering mind and body from their sloth. And what exactly did the Face say when they did a feature on the scene? Well, they said this: consigned to a foul demise by the forces of cash and chaos, punk broods alone in its dark tomb. Its evolution away from the light has been a cruel and twisted one, from guerrilla assault on the media to ghost dancing on the bones of Red Indian mysticism, from glue to gothic. Naturally, unattended for so long, its hair has grown, and so have its aspirations. It has risen to the call of groups like Southern Death Cult and Sex Gang Children, and craves a positive communion through music. Yeah, well, I don't know about that. But there was enough interest and action around this new scene that Polydor Records gave the club its own record. It's a compilation album entitled Batcave, Young Limbs and Numb Hymns, and it featured songs by Specimen, Test Department, and Alien Sex Fiend, among others. Of course, the one band synonymous with the Batcave was its house band, Specimen. After all, they're the ones who started the club. Both Ollie and John were in Specimen, as well as Kevin Mills. Ollie, when he left the band, turned into a rave DJ and went by Space Tribe. John Klein, he went on to be a Banshee. And Kevin Mills, he joined Flesh for Lulu. The DJ at the club was Hamish McDonald, who also started a band, the Sex Gang Children. Now, it's funny to note they got their name from Culture Club, who originally called themselves the Sex Gang Children. And it's funny to note that Andy Sex Gang plays the very un-goth xylophone on one of their early singles. And let's not forget Alien Sex Fiend. They also sprang forth out of the Batcave scene. But it wasn't just the Batcave that was putting out good records in '83. There were also other established goth acts that were releasing stuff, like Bauhaus with Burning from the Inside. The Church put out Seance. Cocteau Twins, Dance Society. The Bunnymen put out Porcupine. And of course, my favorites, Flesh for Lulu, they had their debut. And this, of course, is an undeniable goth anthem in Subterraneans. This is Flesh for Lulu.
From under the swinging shade, here's where the bets are made. They sing you like a song. You can wish the moon right out of the sky. Your eyes, the diamonds, make me blind. Here we going now. I'm going off to find subterranean. Singing like a song, and you can wish the moon right out of the sky. Cry the diamonds from your eyes. Wish the moon right out of the sky. Oh, you shine, subterranean. You shine, subterraneans. Where the cruelest camouflage. I just passing through me. Everything happens after dark. Subterranean. Here we going now. Oh, but I find you. Everything happens after dark. After dark. Everything happens after dark. Everything happens after dark. Everything happens after dark. On subterranean. Yeah, new rivals, two by two. Oh, we're gonna wish the moon right out of the sky. Eyes, the diamonds that make me blind. Wish the moon right out of the sky. Where you going now? Hey, where you going now? Where you going now? New rivals, subterranean. Subterraneans, where the coolest camouflage. I'm just passing through me. Everything happens after dark. Here we
Sarah Roberts is in jeopardy.
Hey, lady, how about it?
Stay with her. Help her, for she has begun to feel the awful horror of the hunger. John Blaylock, the hunger has given him everlasting life. Until now, pray for him. Miriam Blaylock. She feeds 1 day in 7 on the unsuspecting, and soon she will turn into something that you will never be able to forget. No matter how hard and how long you try, fear her.
There's no denying the effect that this film had in 1983 either on the whole world of goth, and I'm talking about The Hunger. It had a huge impact on goth. When it first was released, it was received kind of lukewarm, but it soon found its home as a cult classic. David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve played a vampire couple in love with their doctor, Susan Sarandon. Here again, we have that glam goth connection with Bauhaus in the opening of the film and Bowie as its main star. Bowie would later comment that he thought the opening of the movie was great, saying the first 20 minutes rattle along like hell. It's really a great opening. Well, one thing's for sure, it definitely made goth clubbing look enticing and like the thing to do, and it also helped vampirism gain a new foothold as well.
The timeless beauty of Catherine Deneuve, the cruel elegance of David Bowie, the open sensuality of Susan Sarandon, combined to create a modern classic of perverse fear. Haunting, mysterious, sensual, strange, perverse, riveting. The Hunger.
You have to understand too how this film took goth all over the world, and clubs soon started their own goth nights. Fred Berger, who's a New York City photographer, said the film was such a huge influence on him that he started the goth magazine Propaganda, which, by the way, was America's longest-running magazine dedicated solely to goth culture, and that ran from 1982 to 2002. By 1983, goth was official. People had started calling it the genre, the scene, by a name. Goth, well, gothic had been shortened to goth, and everyone knew what that tag meant and what kind of music it was and what to expect if you said you were going to a goth club. And it is at this time, between 1983 and 1986, when goth hit the big time. Pardon the pun, if you will, but between those years of 83 and 86, goth was truly batshit crazy. Bands had become fully realized and were writing some of their and the era's best stuff. There was a cornucopia of fantastic releases. The Church with Heyday and Starfish, the Cocteau Twins with their absolute classic Treasure, the Bunnymen with Ocean Rain, and The Cure with a double header of The Top and Head on the Door. Flesh for Lulu released their fantastic Big Fun City. The Banshees did Hyena and Tinderbox. We had debuts by This Mortal Coil, Zymox, Love and Rockets, and Peter Murphy, and let's not forget the Sisters of Mercy. Killing Joke also put out their masterpiece with Nighttime. Gene Loves Jezebel, they had a doubleheader as well with The Immigrant and Discover. And Nick Cave did his early classic, Your Funeral, My Trial. We also had a few more debuts by the likes of The Mission, and the Wolfgang Press did an outstanding job with Standing Up Straight. I'm telling you, between 83 and 86, goth was truly golden, and this was when it was at its peak. It's really hard to pinpoint the exact time the Batcave closed, but we know it closed sometime in 1985 because it moved finally out of Soho into a different location, but eventually found its home in a new night in Slimes, or the Slime Light as it was called. Of course, once again, Slime Light is a play on words making fun of the trendy Limelight Club. Anyway, the goth camp, things were starting to sour within the goth camp, and it was starting to splinter. There was different styles of music brewing within the scene. It seemed like one half of the goth camp was going for a harder style of music, and the other side were going for a more electronic side of music. And so the unity wasn't as cohesive as it used to be. And the move to the Slime Light really drove the point home when they started a membership policy, which really tried to keep anyone that was a non-goth out. Of course, as the club fell apart and the camps took side, it's easy to see why the whole scene started to get a bit shaky. But by the time this was happening, word had spread, taste had changed, and now goth had left its lair and was sprinkled all over the world. By the late 80s, you can safely say goth nights were everywhere, from London to Tokyo, from Paris to Houston. It didn't matter. If there was a club in town, chances are you could hear some sort of goth music on some sort of goth night. As with countless stories, just as the scene is becoming truly established, the wheels are falling off the wagon. If you think about it, it's really odd. Bauhaus had already broken up before goth had ever been truly tagged as goth, or even before the movie The Hunger came out. The Cure had all but broken up by 1984 when Robert Smith recorded and released The Top basically as a solo album. And it was at this point he made no bones, pardon the pun again, about saying, this is the last thing The Cure will ever do. It's over, it's over. Looking back, you can see how the Banshees had already gone through some lineup changes. The Sisters of Mercy, even though they finally got their debut album out in 85, they had already lost half the band. While touring behind the LP in the UK, they lost their other founding member, Gary Marks, and finished it all up as a three-piece, with the final farewell gig being filmed at the Royal Albert Hall. It's preserved out there as Wake if you want to see the very last official Sisters performance. When Gary Marks left the Sisters, he went on to form Ghost Dance, and by 1986, the last remaining two Sisters left, and they started the Mission. Crazy to think on their second album they would be having a member of Led Zeppelin produce it, and that was John Paul Jones. And Bauhaus members, they split off and did Love and Rockets, and Peter Murphy went off with Mick Karn from Japan to form Dolly's Car. But it was truly in 1987 that goth had been fully engulfed in the mainstream and was on its way out. Hollywood had taken a big bite, and that's always a kiss of death. Remember John Hughes? He did Some Kind of Wonderful, and on the soundtrack he put Flesh for Lulu and the March Violets on it. And the year before, when he did Ferris Bueller's Day Off, anyone notice the shot when Ferris is in his room? There's a big Flesh for Lulu poster up on the wall. Check this out. The Cure in 1987 released their double album Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, and it actually entered into the US Top 40. A double LP for a goth band, and the first time a goth band entered into the US Top 40. The Banshees too, they put out a cover album and had songs on it that they were doing by The Doors and Dylan. Sisters of Mercy, well, it was a Sister of Mercy. It was just down to Andrew Eldritch by now. He did admit that he drafted in Patricia Morrison only as eye candy because he said she never really did anything. The Sisters, they released their biggest album ever in Floodland, but they never played live. Ever since that final gig at the Royal Albert Hall, no other gigs were played by the Sisters again until the early 90s. The Cult, in 1987, they found AC/DC, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Rick Rubin, their new producer, totally changed their sound, and from that point on, they would just be like rock and roll goofos after that. And their mates, Balaam and the Angel, same story. They got bit by the biker bug and AC/DC and put out their Live Free or Die. Love and Rockets, just a few singles back, were covering Pink Floyd. Now they're basically aping Jethro Tull with flute solos on their latest LP, Earth, Sun, and Moon. The Cocteau Twins, who would have ever thought about that? They're on the brink of commercial success with their major label deal in the United States. And now, Dead Can Dance, they're simply being called neoclassical. And funnily enough, Peter Murphy, he was poised to make his debut in the Billboard charts, which would come just 1 year after this in 1989. The label, which had bred so many goth bands, Beggar's Banquet, they were now releasing records by the likes of the Pixies, Throwing Muses, the Charlatans, and you could sense everything was changing direction to turn into what would soon be called shoegaze and a whole new slew of indie artists. And yes, 89, that was the dead end. This is the last great year of goth, and this was the true end of what we say trad goth, or I say the golden era of goth. For it was in 1989, it brought forth the last of the torchbearers of true goth in the spaghetti western ghouls of Fields of the Nephilim, who themselves would be finished, over and done with, just a few years later by 1991. Yes, it's easy to say, goth was done. Even the band themselves realized they were somewhat of a laughingstock. This genre was decaying, and their flower-dusted get-up with wide-brim hats and long rider coats just made it all seem so silly. The Music Weekly melody maker was always having laughs at the band's expense, but they did actually ask the drummer Nod Wright to have his own column, which he called the Nod Corner, and in his column, he himself would make fun of the band and the goth scene. A few years later, by 1996, even the Banshees were finished.
Reach out for you.
And through it all, The Cure, the band that wanted to be the next Elvis Costello. They just kept plodding along, having newer and younger groups start to cite them as a major influence. They ended up doing a remix album. They actually employed an ex-guitarist of David Bowie to be a band member for a while, and just got bigger and bigger crowds with every step they take. Actually, having one of their biggest hits ever in the 90s. That's crazy. Who would have thought of that? And you know what? Eventually, they found themselves in the ultimate commercial acceptance by being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2019. Just 40 short years after their debut. And they are the only true goth band ever to have that honor. Oddly enough, the same year The Cure was inducted, they were inducted with one of their big influences, Roxy Music. And another big goth influence is actually being inducted this year with T-Rex. Man, thanks for everybody taking time out to check out the podcast. I hope you listened to both episodes because it was well worth it. At least I think so, and I hope you did too. Please remember, get in touch with any ideas you may have or any feedback. You can write me at noisyrecordsmx@hotmail.com. Likewise, look us up, Noisy Records, on Instagram, and you can be up to the minute, up to date with what's going on. Truly appreciate you spending time with us. Have a great week. See you next time on the Noisy Records podcast.